Start by removing the float bowl. Most carburetors are going to have a metal bowl, but I have a plastic bowl which is pretty old, about 25, 30 years old. It was an upgrade to do independent floats, which you'll see when I get this open, but most are going to have a metal float bowl with a combined float system. This one has independent floats. Get this top off first. These screws tend to be or may be very hard to get out, and it's helpful to put some penetrating oil on them first so that they're a little bit easier to get out. I did that a day ago, so hopefully these come out a little easier. Okay, so we can take off this top. It's got a rubber seal inside it. See, this needle is in pretty bad shape. It's got a lot of corrosion on it, so we'll replace that. This rubber diaphragm looks like it's actually in decent shape, but we will replace that too. So we can remove these 4 screws. So this is just a metal ring. You can leave the 4 screws in there. There's your diaphragm. Now this needle is a little bit hard to get out. You actually have to twist it and pull it at the same time. And it's kind of hard to get a good grip on. But the end of it, here's a new one. The end of it has notches in it, and those are really settings. So as you press the needle in upward, there's 2 spring-loaded bars that will clip in to one of those grooves, and the grooves alternate, and there's 4 total. Typically, I think the average setting is the 3rd click down. So you'll push it in, it'll click into the 1st setting, then you'll twist it, which will force the bars, spring-loaded bars open, and then as you push up, it'll drop back into the 2nd one, twist and push, and then it'll drop into the 3rd. So to remove it is the reverse process. You twist and pull instead of twist and push. And since I'm not using this needle, I'm going to go ahead and use some pliers on here, and I'm just going to grab it. There's 1 click, and by the way, you need to count the clicks just to verify what setting you are on. So that was 1, 2, and out. So really what we started on was we were on the 3rd setting, and we went 1, 2, out. Okay, so now we can flip this over. It makes it easier to work on. So we can begin by removing the idle jet. It's got an O-ring on the end that may grip on. Now, this is why, or one of the reasons why we're rebuilding this, is you can see this O-ring is pretty old and falling apart. Move the throttle adjustment screw. This one has a spring on it that we'll get out here in a second, but that O-ring actually looks not too bad, but that will be replaced. So tip it over and get that little spring out. That spring goes right on here. This is the main jet. Oh, that actually came out all together. This is a separate piece here. There's not enough width to get my wrench on there. I wanted to show you guys how I ended up getting these two apart. The problem I was having was that I couldn't get the thickness of my wrench couldn't fit in under between the washer and this other piece. You may have wrenches that are thinner, and I remembered that I had these, or actually my son remembered that I had this set of thinner wrenches, and so that was able to easily go on and hold the lower jet body, main jet body, and then I was able to then just hold it tight and remove the main jet and washer. Next we have to tap out this pin that holds in the float assembly here, arm. Now one side of these pins is knurled and the other is not. And I believe that the side with your Bing logo on it is the knurled side, although this one's harder to tell. So I'm going to carefully start driving out this side just so I can verify. Clip. And then I'm going to set it on the edge of this workbench. I'm first just going to verify that the knurled end is coming out first, and it is. There's splines on that end. So I am driving out the right side, the correct side. I'm going to switch to a narrow punch here. So that frees that up. This is kind of stubborn coming out. That is bent. It's probably hard to tell in the video, but I can feel as it rolls that this end is bent. So I have replacement pins for those anyways. This is also very pitted. It doesn't look rusted, but it's very pitted, so that will get replaced. Inside there is the needle. My version has the spring-loaded ball in the end and the steel tip. We're also going to replace this seat, this brass seat in there, because as this needle wore into the seat, they kind of mated with each other or created a surface that could leak if I just put a new needle in and not replace the seat, especially since this has about 75,000 miles on it. Now to do that, you can pull it out with a little jig that you can make, like a reverse press. What I'm going to do to pull this seat out is I first have to tap some threads into that brass seat. And I'm going to use a number 7 tap. This is the tap I got, or not a number 7, but a 7mm 1 thread pitch, as well as a 7mm bolt with the same thread pitch, 7mm nut, a washer, and a larger nut. And the way this will work is once we thread that, once we tap it all the way down to the bottom, we'll place this nut as a spacer because the diameter is larger than the seat. And then we're going to thread this bolt in here. We're going to put the washer on, thread this bolt down in there. Once the bolt bottoms out, then we will run this nut down, and as we tighten the nut, it's going to force the bolt up, which will pull out the seat, and we should be able to pull it right out. It's not hard to cut through the threads, but there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room. Now I should note, if you have a rubber tipped needle on your carburetor, then you want to use an 8mm tap, not a 7mm. Okay. Then we can place our nut on there, our washer, thread our bolts in there. Once it's down, once it's kind of bottomed out and tight, the bolt, then you can go ahead with the nut and just kind of work slowly. Make sure your nut is centered so that you're for sure over the seat. Just take it slow. Sometimes it's going to turn them both, so you're going to have to hold one still. But it's the nut you want to turn, not the bolt. And I'm just going to test it, look and see, just to make sure everything's okay. We should see it have started to come up, and it has. There's a little ridge there. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't pulling it from my tapped threads. It's a good idea to replace the seats while you're working on this, because you could go through all this work, put everything together, and then find that you just perpetually have a leak in your carburetor because the needle will not seat properly and constantly let fuel in. And there's the seat. Now we'll pull this old gasket out. There's also the couple of jets in the bottom here for the main jet that the main jet mates to. These two come apart, the diffuser and the jet needle. We'll clean those up. Now we can remove the choke assembly. I'm trying not to put too much pressure on these end stops because they're just aluminum and I don't want to snap them. So you have to kind of use your hand to stop that lever. So you may remember the orientation when you take this off, that the lever points to this humped end here. There's also a slightly offset dimple right here on this shaft that is more towards the front of this choke assembly, this humped portion, than it is behind. So it's just slightly off center. That dimple needs to be pointing the same way as the lever and as the hump. You also can always refer to your other carburetor if you run into questions. There's a little wave washer on here too that's coming off with everything. So we can set those there. They'll all come out. They'll all get cleaned. We'll remove these screws. We can take this gasket off. Now we'll take off the throttle assembly butterfly. You can take the spring off. If you run into questions, just look at your other carburetor to determine the way that everything goes together. So don't take both carburetors apart at the same time unless you really are confident you know how everything goes. As these get sandwiched together and need to go in a certain way, I'm going to take the butterfly valve out. Now this, as you probably know, these screws in here are usually peened on the end so that they don't back out by themselves, so that if you just simply start unscrewing them, you're going to mess up your threads in this brass bar, and we want to avoid that. So a lot of guys will take a Dremel tool and grind those down. I have a Dremel, but I don't feel comfortable sending it in there, so I just simply use a file and I just hold it flat and I just work my way around those screws, just taking off the proud edge, and then I rotate the screw a little bit, and because I can't quite get to the whole thing. I'm sure this takes a lot more time, but I just feel more comfortable rather than putting a power tool in there. Okay, after about 20 minutes of meticulous filing with the jeweler's file and rotating the screws a little bit, filing a little more, rotating, they're ready to come out. Just want to make sure that they're able to come out nice and easily. We'll replace those screws and we'll use Loctite rather than peening them. Then you just want to, now that you've got the screws out, you just want to carefully take this disc out. Just try not to mar up the walls. This disc is also marked with a little peen mark right at the top, and that will be put in just like this with the peen mark facing out and on top. So when we reassemble it, we'll be taking note of that. Okay, now we're able to remove these screws. and take out that bar. This bracket holds the throttle bar piece in. So once we remove these screws, we should be able to slide this bar out. And the whole reason we're doing this is because there's an O-ring on that throttle shaft. So that, you may be able to tell, that locks into a groove. So we can remove that, and then we should be able to slide this out. And there's our O-ring right there, which is pretty flat. So we'll get those off later and clean that up. So the last thing we have to remove is the throttle adjustment. So you don't want to lose this little piece here that just goes right inside the spring. So there's all our parts. We've removed everything we can from the carburetor, or that we're going to remove. And now we'll clean everything up really good. What I'll probably do is use some carburetor cleaner in a bowl and let these soak in the bowl for a few hours. And then I'll remove all the O-rings first. Remove all the O-rings. You can do that just with some pliers by kind of gripping onto the O-ring. That one is pretty brittle. On this choke, you simply push this piece out. And there's an O-ring. That one's been really worn flat. There's an O-ring right there too. The rest of this assembly I will leave together. I'm not going to take that apart, but I will remove this O-ring, clean it up, put a new O-ring on it, and then we will reassemble.